In Suddagud Telik Chowra, the antediluvian Fintan MacBrochra brought Tara and Uisneach into close conjunction by comparing them to the two kidneys in a beast. The implication would appear to be that they were regarded in some sense as twin centres of the island. For Alwyn and Brinley Rees, the analogy is a significant feature, and they draw a parallel with types of dual ritual sites known in Rome and in India that had been discussed in some detail by Georges Dumézil. According to the Brahmanas, each sacrificial fire site must comprise of 2 essential fires and 1 accessory fire. Of the 2 essential fires, one, the Garhapatya, or the fire of the householder, provides the flame from which all others are kindled. No offerings are made there. It signifies possession of the land and symbolizes the terrestrial world of mankind. The second is the Ahavanya, which receives, burns, and transmits the offerings to the gods. It represents the divine celestial world. They differ in form. The Garhapatya is circular, corresponding to this world, while the Ahavanya is square and has its sides oriented to the cardinal points. Dumézil has compared this pair with 2 types of ritual site attested for in ancient Rome. The first, represented by the sanctuary of Vesta and its perpetual fire, was circular in form, contrary to the consecratory ritual of Inauguration, since every augural rite presupposed an orientation. By contrast, the second type is typified by the original city of Rome, or its central symbol, which was quadrata, like the subsequent square or rectangular templa for which it was the prototype. There is therefore some external comparative testimony to lend substance to those medieval Irish texts, reference to the curious coupling of Uisneach and Tara as twin centres of Ireland. Tara was a royal site of significance in the early Middle Ages. It was, as we have seen, closely associated with the Uí Néill, the dynasty descended from Néill Dynasty, Niall of the 9 hostages, whose obit is probably to be dated about the middle of the 5th century, and also with the concept of the High Kingship, which figures almost as prominently in modern scholarship about the Middle Ages as in the historical scholarship of the later Middle Ages themselves. By the end of the 5th century, the Ullid, who had dominated the province of Ulster from their centre at Owenmacha, had been overthrown and lordship of much of the northern territories usurped by the offspring of Néill Dynasty, the Uí Néill, in the course of their expansion northward from their probable homeland in the Midland region. Thus, the O'Neill kingdoms and their dependent tribes came to control a vast swathe of land in the Midlands and the north, and the scholarly consensus has been that their acknowledged head, as King of Tara, became, in the normal course of events, the most powerful ruler in Ireland, though not King of Ireland. Recently, however, the generally accepted view that the kingship of Tara was a virtual monopoly of the Uí Néill has been brought into question. On the basis of the several variant versions of the regnal lists of Tara, Thomas Charles Edwards notes that dynasties other than the O'Neill claim to have held the kingship of Tara, quote, at various points from the 5th to the middle of the 7th century, end quote, and concludes that such claims would have been pointless had the lordship of Tara been simply an over-kingship of the Uí Néill. In fact, quote, that kingship must have represented the summit of regality for all such claimants and their peoples, end quote. This, he adds, is further supported by the impartial testimony of several law tracts redacted in Munster which clearly represent Tara, quote, as the seat of an hegemony that, in some way or another, embraced all Ireland, end quote. By the later Middle Ages, those individuals who could with some reason lay claim to such a status were frequently accorded the honorific title of High King, or Ard Rí of Ireland, a designation whose significance has been considerably deflated by modern scholars, among whom there is a broad consensus that the High Kingship was the creation of the medieval historians and lacked traditional legal validity. D.A. Binchy claimed that the Norse invasions and the reactions to them served to create a sense of national identity from the 9th century onwards, and at the same time to reinforce the political fiction of the High Kingship cultivated by the literary propagandists of the Uí Néill. Such political reality as the title acquired was a relatively late development. From this he proceeded to the rather more debatable conclusion that the kingship of Tara, with which the notion of the High Kingship was so frequently associated, was of little national significance. He clinched his argument by noting that the very term Ardrí, or High King, was patently a late compound, and the expected earlier form of Ardrí was not attested in the law texts. Since then, Liam Brathnach has noted that there are at least 2 instances of Ardrí in legal texts and several others in non-legal sources. In one of the 2 legal instances, Ardrí is used of the Heavenly Lord of Christianity. In the other, it refers to Uí Néill, King of Tara. The existence of such an early term already displaced from current usage by about the 7th century does not of course gainsay the modern view that the later medieval notion of a political high kingship was largely the invention of learned authors working in the interest of the Uí Néill and other dynasties. On the other hand, the apparent lack of such a term can no longer be used as an argument against the importance and antiquity of Tara's preeminence as a ritual centre of kingship in Ireland. The sphere of realpolitik is another matter. There is general agreement that many of those described as kings of Tara in the historical period, whether of Niall's progeny or not, could not realistically have claimed or aspired to be high kings of all Ireland in terms of political power before the 9th or 10th century. Yet learned tradition traced the primacy of Tara kingship to the earliest historical period and beyond. As modern historians have remarked, the problem with the identification of the High Kingship with the Kingship of Tara, so assiduously cultivated by late medieval historians, the Shanachie, is that the further back we follow recorded history, the less evidence there is for a centralized monarchy. On the other hand, by the 9th century, when the first serious attempts were made to turn the idea into a reality, Tara had long since been abandoned. The most likely explanation of this paradox, and one consistent with the evidence, is that Tara and its kingship had always enjoyed primacy over other royal centres, but a primacy that was rooted in a conceptual schema that was religious and ideological in its origins, rather than conventionally political. T.M. Charles Edwards, commenting on the readiness of the Irish to use prehistoric sites as ceremonial capitals, observes that they conceived of royal power as being, quote, encapsulated in seats of kingship, which depended for their significance on a reference to the past, and these seats of kingship were primarily settings for the ritual of kingship rather than regular residences. Indeed, since many kings of Tara were based many miles from Brega, let alone Tara itself, the likelihood is that an incoming king of Tara made a solemn entry into the site. End quote. This symbolic primacy is reflected in a phrase from the Old Irish law tract Brehon na Med Tosach, which is of Munster, not Uí Néill provenance. It says, quote, abundance, the feast of Tara, the binding of kings by contract, validate a king of kings. And in the closely related triad, 3 things that validate a king: a contract with other kings, the feast of Tara, and abundance during his reign. Taking these 3 constituents in reverse order, the third refers to what is perhaps the most conspicuous mark of the righteous ruler, that there be peace, prosperity, and fertility in his kingdom, and the second to the traditional ritual of installation that validates his rule, while the first acknowledges that such political seniority as he enjoys by virtue of his title depends on the willingness of other kings to formally accept his precedents. The relevant legal documentation is early in literary historical terms, but late in the context of the active mytho-religious role of Tara, and it is therefore significant, as Uisneach has pointed out, that several 7th or 8th century texts redacted in learned centres in Munster, beyond the sphere of influence of the Uí Néill, nonetheless indicate clearly their acceptance of Tara's special status. Quote, in summary, therefore, it may be concluded that Tara's status as caput scotorum was accurate, albeit, like Murchu's view of Niall ní Gaelic as origo stirpis regiae huius pene insulae, with some qualification. It appears that by the 7th century the original sacral function of Tara, which had been partially the reason for the site's prestige, was put aside and was refashioned by the Uí Néill, and most especially by some of the southern dynasties, for their own ends. Politically, the title of Rex Temro in the 7th and early 8th centuries denoted some form of supremacy in Ireland, which was dependent on the success of an individual king and not solely on recognition by other Uí Néill dynasts and by Armagh, but to an extent on the attitude of Munster kings, lawyers and ecclesiastics. End quote. In its age of glory as represented retrospectively in the written literature, Tara's most familiar associations are with great mytho-heroic figures like Conaire, Con Céad Chachach, who's Con of the 100 Battles, Cormac Mac Airt and Néill ní Gaelic, all of whom personify various aspects of the traditional ideology of sacral kingship. Conaire, acknowledged as son of King Airt and Mes Buachalla, was in fact the son of a birdman, who, assuming human form, visited Mes Buachalla and begot the child upon her the night before her marriage to Airt. After the latter's death, the youthful Conaire, while abroad hunting, was confronted by a company of the birdmen, whose leader instructed him to proceed to Tara, where he would be elected king through the mantic ritual of the bull feast, designed to identify the rightful candidate. Another early tale about Conaire's ascension gives a different account of the ritual of selection. To quote Lucius Gwyn, there was a king's chariot at Tara. To the chariot were yoked 2 steeds of the same colour, which had never before been harnessed. It would tilt up before any man who was not destined to receive the kingship of Tara, so that he could not control it, and the horses would spring at him. And there was a king's mantle in the chariot. Whoso might not receive Tara's sovereignty, the mantle was ever too big for him. And there were 2 flagstones in Tara, Block and Blooney. When they accepted a man, they would open before him until the chariot went through. And Fál was there, the stone penis at the head of the chariot course. When a man should have the kingship of Tara, it screeched against his chariot axle, so that all might hear. But the 2 stones, Block and Blooney, would not open before one who should not hold the sovereignty of Tara, and their usual position was such that one's hand could only pass sideways between them. Also, he who was not to hold Tara's kingship, the foil, would not screech against his axle. End quote. The phallic standing stone mentioned here is simply called Fál, but it is also known from other medieval texts as the Fál or the Stone of Fál. It has been suggested that the opening of the 2 touching stones to allow the ordinand access to the Fál conveys a strong sexual symbolism, and certainly this would not be out of place in the context of so richly redolent of the Hyros Gamos. Even as late as the 19th century, local Irish speakers referred to the Fál colloquially as the penis of Fergus, evoking the memory of the hero Fergus MacRoach, who had ruled over the Ulstermen until displaced by Conaire, and who was renowned, in tradition, for his gargantuan sexual appetites, as well as for his valour. He shared the name Fergus, literally virile vigour, with several other Ulster kings, and it has been suggested that, quote, it may have been the cult name of the Ulster king or his patron divinity, end quote. As for Conaire, just as his succession to the kingship came about through supernatural agency, so in the end were his reign and his life terminated through supernatural intervention. At the time of his ascension, he is warned of the list of gesa, or taboos, which he must at all times observe at risk of disaster, and which, in the event magically controlled circumstances, render impossible of fulfillment. As an exemplar of the ideal king, his reign brings peace and well-being to the land. But he violates one of his taboos, and the principle of kingly justice, known as fear flahamon, the truth or righteousness of a prince, when he fails to exact due retribution from his 3 marauding foster brothers. Immediately, a train of events is set in motion, which leads him inevitably to violate his gesa, one by one, and leads inexorably to his death in a welter of violence at the feast in the Brehon, or hostel, of Da Durga, otherwise the feast presided over by the red deity of the otherworld of the dead. Like Conaire, Cormac Mac Airt, grandson of the great Con Céad Chahach, Con of the 100 Battles, is pictured in the medieval literature as an exemplar of the fear flahamon, the truth and justice of a ruler, that is the mark of a righteous king. If he has any claim to historicity, which is doubtful, though medieval historians appear to have assigned him to the 3rd century, his name has attracted a proliferation of myth and legend that obscures it quite effectively. He is known as a great lawgiver and is appropriately credited with the authorship of the Old Irish text Teachosca Cormac, the Instructions of Cormac, a collection of gnomic sayings on the wise exercise of kingship supposedly addressed by Cormac to his son Carbury. Early Irish redactors were quick to perceive biblical analogies for such outstanding characters. At least one text compares Cormac to Solomon, and the banqueting hall which he is credited with building at Tara is described in the Dinshenkis in terms largely derived from the account of Solomon's temple in the Book of Kings. In common with other legendary kings and heroes, he was conceived in extraordinary circumstances on the night before his father Airt died in battle. He was carried off by a she-wolf at birth and nurtured by her with her cubs, and finally cared for by his father's friend Lugna, or his foster father Fiachra Cassan. Eventually, he sets out for Tara, where he comes upon a woman voicing her unhappiness at a verdict pronounced by the king, Uí Mac Cana. Her sheep, having grazed on the king's woad field, he had declared them forfeit. But Cormac pointed out that this judgment was flawed, since the grass would grow again, and therefore the appropriate fine for their trespass was the corresponding crop from the sheep, a single shearing of wool. Luid, realizing that his own right to rule had been diminished by his one false judgment, stepped aside to make way for Cormac as rightful king of Tara. Another and variant version of Cormac's access to Tara is reflected in the pleasing, almost lyrical little tale of Esnada Tí Buchat, the melodies of Buchat's house, which in its extant form belongs perhaps to the 9th century. Aithne, daughter of Cathair Mór, king of Leinster, was in fosterage with the herdsman Buchat, a hospitaller of the king, but clearly a divine figure, who had been brought to ruin by the extravagant demands of Cathair's 12 sons and was forced to migrate in dire poverty to Ceannas, which is Kells, in Meath. Cormac Mac Airt came upon Aithne gathering rushes and milking cows for her foster father and fell in love with her. When eventually he married Aithne, who is one of the many epiphanies of the goddess of sovereignty, he took up residence at Tara and set about creating the famous structures of Rathnaree, the Rath or Fort of the Kings, and the banqueting hall. The earliest regnal list for the kingship of Tara is that of the late 7th century text Baile Chuind, the vision of Con Céad Cathach, which purports to prophesy the individual kings who were to reign in Tara from the time of his son Airt onward. Its literal formula for X shall reign is X shall drink it, where the formal potion presented to the ordinand is employed as a synonym for the combined ceremony of sacral investiture and the exercise of kingship. The text is devoid of explanatory introduction and is presumably to be understood as spoken by Con himself, but when it was reworked and expanded in a more narrative context in the 9th century as the tale called Baile in Scal, the Phantom's Vision, the prophecy is spoken by the god Lugh, the Irish and Celtic divinity traditionally regarded as personifying the ideal of kingship. It tells how Con went on a circuit of the rampart of Tara accompanied by his 3 druids to guard against incursions by hostile forces from the otherworld, perhaps a reference to the familiar taboo that forbade the king to let the sun rise on him in Tara. The perils attaching to the ambivalent status of Tara, poised between the secular and the supernatural domains, are reflected in other contexts and, as Francis John Byrne has remarked, quote, they suggest that the ramparts at Tara were designed as a defence against a hostile otherworld, end quote. One recalls, for example, the story of Airt Mac Cana from Siad Finnachad, who came regularly to Tara at Samhain or Halloween. He lulled its people to sleep with his supernatural music, his Ceol Sheehy, and burned it down with a pillar of fire until finally he was slain by Finn MacCool. Similarly, when Con mounted the rampart of Tara, he came into direct contact with the otherworld, though in this instance under one of its more benign aspects. A magic mist enveloped the king and his companions, and a horseman, the Ska, or Phantom, approached and asked them to accompany him to his dwelling. Within, they found a girl seated on a chair of crystal and wearing a golden crown. Beside her stood a vessel of gold with a golden cup nearby. The Phantom, seated on his throne, identified himself as the god Lugh and declared that he had come to announce to them the names of Con's successors and the duration of their reigns. The girl was the sovereignty of Ireland, and when she asked to whom she should offer the cup of red ale, the Phantom enumerated his catalogue of the kings who would follow Con. As with other kingships, whether major or minor, each new lord of Tara was formally secured in office by the ritual ceremony that legitimized him as the rightful spouse of his kingdom. Later medieval accounts of royal inaugurations bear witness to the gradual infiltration of the ceremony by local or regional ecclesiastics, but the role of the Fili, the learned poets and king's councillors, remains prominent, and clearly it was they, and doubtless the Druids before them, who officiated in pre-Christian times. Even in the period after the coming of the Normans, they generally retained their central role. In a tract on the kings of Connacht, quote, at least parts of which seem based on 12th or 13th century original, end quote, it was the kings Olaf of history, Uí Néill Dynasty, who had the privilege of conferring the kingship. Quote, and it is Uí Néill Dynasty who is entitled to give the rod of kingship into his hand at his inauguration, and none of the nobles of Connacht has a right to be with him on the mound save Uí Néill Dynasty, who inaugurates him, and O'Conachtan, who keeps the gate of the mound and whose duty it is to make the mound ready when it is required. End quote. The inauguration was thus a hieros gamos, a sacred marriage, presided over originally by the priest-poet seer, uniting the king with his territory, conceived in the form of a goddess. Separately, the name for such a ceremony and the feast which would normally have accompanied it was feish, the verbal noun of the verb foit, meaning to spend the night or sleep with, and by extension, entertainment or hospitality for the night, a feast or festival. The term and the figure continued to be used by poets and historians long after the coming of the Normans. In 1319, for example, the Annals of Connacht and the Annals of Loch Kay record the inauguration of Phelim O'Conaire as King of Connacht at the traditional inauguration site of Carnfraoch in County Roscommon. Quote, "And after Phelim had married the province of Connacht, a great Banach Rig, or royal wedding feast, was held that evening." In functional terms, all royal inaugurations were equivalent, but it seems clear from the literary testimonies that the consecration of the king of Tara had special significance, if only as a primus inter pares. Most historians of the period have recognized the essential incompatibility between the countrywide establishment of Christianity and the earlier and still tenacious associations of Tara with the pagan religious system. As D.A. Bingie puts it a little baldly, quote, "For it is obvious that this pagan fertility rite, the festival of Tara, with a quasi-divine king at its centre, could not survive the Christianization of the Tara dynasty." End quote. From the time of Leary, son of Uí Néill Dynasty, who, it would appear, refused to be baptized, relations between the church and the kings of Tara were, on the available evidence, fraught with uncertainty regarding certain areas of traditional practice and belief. The last celebration of Feis Teora recorded in historical records was held by King Dermot MacCarroll, ruler of all Ireland, according to Adalbhan, Columkill's 7th century biographer, and this has been cited, with other sources, as evidence that Dermot was at best ambivalent in his attitude to the church and Christianity. By the same token, the subsequent lapse of the festival is seen as proof of the steady expansion of the church's influence, though not to the extent that all clerical scholars could rid themselves of their deep-set prejudice and apprehensions, constantly refueled by the numerous tales and traditions that recall Tara's former sacred and central role in the pre-Christian Irish view of the cosmos. St. Patrick's late 7th century biographer, Mullachu Mochomahony, has little doubt as to what Tara and its rituals stand for. Quote, "It so happened in that year that a feast of pagan worship was being held, which the pagans used to celebrate with many incantations and magic rites and other superstitious acts of idolatry. There assembled the kings, satraps, leaders, princes, and the nobles of the people. Furthermore, the druids, the fortune-tellers, and the inventors and teachers of every craft and every skill were also summoned to King Leary at Tara, their Babylon, as they had been summoned at one time to Nebuchadnezzar, and they held and celebrated their pagan feast on the same night on which Holy Patrick celebrated Easter." When Christian apologists focus on, and as likely as not created, the legend of St. Patrick's visit to Tara and to King Leary MacNeill as a pivotal event in the saint's mission to the Irish, it was an obvious recognition of the symbolic status of Tara and its centrality, both locative and figurative, in the indigenous ideology of kingship. The triumph of Patrick's Easter fire over that lighted by the Druids at Tara was intended to epitomise the more general triumph of Christianity over Druidic paganism. The Hill of Tara as a Centre of Sacred Kingship by Prionsias Mac Cana.